Hi, everyone. Welcome to Kindred Skulls. I'm Matt Freese, and I'm here with a solo episode for you today. Nick wasn't available to make it, but I still have an exciting episode nonetheless. I'm going to go through and do a mock free agency for the Vikings. So I've taken basically everything into account, from contracts to comp picks to like everything you can want to in terms of Vikings free agency, in terms of their needs and that sort of thing. And I've come up with real contract suggestions for a ton of different players. I'm excited to dive into it. So let's get started. First, I want to say, like, the premise of this mock free agency is that we're going to let Sam Darnold walk. I think that's a pretty obvious move that the Vikings are angling to make here. And then we want to make sure we get our third round comp pick back for Sam Darnold, because that'll be the 97th overall pick in the 2026 draft, just like the Vikings have the 97th overall pick in the 2025 draft because of Kirk Cousins, right? So that's a pretty valuable pick, a top 100 pick. Carries a significant amount of value. I don't know from an analytics perspective exactly what that equates to in terms of cap dollars, but it's probably around $10 million or something like that. So it's something that you definitely want to have on your roster. And we're going to try to make sure that we can get that. So to understand how we can get that, there's a couple parameters you need to understand. First of all, you have to allow more compensatory free agents to leave than you sign, right? So the cutoff for compensatory free agent is roughly, or at least at this current moment, it's roughly $2.5 million a year and 53% of the snaps. So the formula combines both the AAV of the player and the percentage of the snaps that they play. The percentage of the snaps is a much lower component. There's also a component in there for postseason awards like Pro Bowl or All Pro. Obviously, for a seventh round comp pick, that's something that I guess is a fringe possibility, right? Zach Bond would be an example of a player who got something like that. But really, the contract value is going to be a lot more impactful than pretty much anything else. So $2.5 million is kind of the rough cutoff there. Mike Gesicki is that player from 2024. We'll see where that goes. It'll probably increase a little bit going into 2023, but I would expect anybody who gets, $3 million plus is going to count as a compensatory pick. And then the cutoff between the third and fourth round is going to stay a bit more solid. So it's based on a percentage of the overall NFL contracts. The only player who's over that limit, who is an impending free agent right now, is Stephon Diggs, who obviously isn't going to make as much as he used to. But that would put Trey Hendrickson, who made $21 million on his contract and played 66% of the snaps, as kind of the cutoff there. So if you pay somebody $21 million and they play 70% of the snaps, which I would hope, which you would think someone who makes that much money is going to play, then they count as a third round pick. So it becomes very difficult for the Vikings to pay somebody $21 million, assuming Sam Darnold clears, I mean, my assumption for Sam Darnold would be something in the $35 million a year range, but assuming he clears, that $21 million threshold or a $25 million threshold and gets injured, something like that, he's basically guaranteed the Vikings to give the Vikings a third round comp pick if they don't sign anybody over that $21 million threshold. But that makes it interesting, right? Because one of our top free agent targets is going to be right around that threshold, I think. Right. So it's kind of an interesting line that you need to walk, and it might inform, and it's definitely going to inform some of the decisions I make here in this free agency. Right. So in terms of my general rule for contracts, I used PFF for the contract numbers, the length, the average annual value, and the total guarantees to the deal. Generally, I tried to structure the contracts so that there was a signing bonus, and then the rest of the AAV for year one was made up by a minimum salary, and then year two had a salary somewhat approaching what the AAV was. Basically, in year one and year two for every one of these contracts, I paid all the guaranteed money. That's typically how NFL contracts are structured at this point. And then in terms of how I'm calculating the cap, I'm doing it in a somewhat unique way for the way I did this exercise. I'll give you what kind of the standard numbers are, but I think that even the over the cap, effective cap space isn't exactly accurate, because effective cap space takes into account what it takes for a team to get up to the top 51 cutoff at this point. And then it also takes into account the added cost due to draft picks for the players, right? So the Vikings will have a first round draft pick. The contract for the 24th overall pick has a certain cap number that it's going to hit. That's going to be larger than minimum. So you take the difference between that cap number and what the minimum salary for players is, and you add that to, or you subtract that from the available cap, right? So they do that for all of their picks. So I took the effective cap space and modified it a little bit. I added 2 extra minimum players to get to a 53-man roster rather than the top 51 cutoff. And then I also added the salaries of 16 practice squad players, which is what the Vikings will have during the course of the season. So that gets us to kind of what they will actually have to pay players over the course of the season and kind of where they'll need to hit on the cap. I think there also may be some cap adjustments that haven't come into play, or haven't been officially announced, right, to the Vikings cap based on what happened in 2024. So we'll have to see what happens when those come in. I'm just trusting the over the cap numbers at this moment that they're right, and making a couple of modifications to give a more realistic scenario for what the cap situation is going to be like on September 1st, rather than, in early March, right? So the Vikings can make more moves than what I'm making here initially, but they'll need to shed salary later to kind of make up for that. I think it would be the lesson. So if I started out right, I'm going to have 2 cap clearing moves for the Vikings. One really doesn't clear any cap because it's something that's kind of already on the books, but I'm going to have Harrison Smith retire for the purposes of this exercise. He could theoretically void his contract still. That's kind of still up in the air on whether or not that's going to happen. That would cost the Vikings slightly more money in 2025, right, this year, but it would save them money in 2026 for Smith's retirement. I was going to do a post June 1st. That's kind of what the Vikings set his contract up to be, because he has a minimum salary. So if Smith retires, he doesn't collect any of the salary that he's owed. So it saves the Vikings the veteran minimum for Harrison Smith, which is $1.255 million, which is the minimum salary for the number of years he's accrued in 2025. So it saves the Vikings that this year. It'll cost them $4.2 million against the cap next year. If he retires before June 1st, the $4.2 million would accelerate into 2025. Or if he's released or voids his contract, whatever the actual mechanism is, he would save the Vikings the $1.255 million, but he would also cost them the additional 4.2, right? So his cap number for this year would increase by about $4 million. The second move I'm going to make is cutting Ed Ingram. And obviously, like, I would totally accept Harrison Smith coming back on a modified deal. It's just for the purposes of this exercise, I kind of wanted to be conservative in terms of what I thought he was going to do. And I did sign a safety to make up for him moving. So you could kind of just replace the value that I put into that safety with Harrison Smith if you think he comes back. But the second move I made was cutting Ed Ingram, right? So Ed Ingram, because he has performance-based pay, which performance-based pay just means it's basically just based on the number of snaps the player has had. There might be a Pro Bowl or all pro component to that, but obviously Ed Ingram hasn't made either of those because he got benched. But still, because he's on his rookie deal in his 4th year, his cap hit is now $3.406 million. So $3,406,000 was what he's scheduled to be paid, because he gets bonuses to that from the amount that he's played, right? He was a starter for basically 3 years. So, 2.5 years. And that adds to what his original base salary was going to be. So cutting Ed Ingram, who fell out of favor, obviously was benched, didn't sniff the lineup, even though Dalton Risner kind of struggled a little bit. I just don't think the Vikings are all that interested in having him back, especially at a $3.5 million almost cap number. So I cut him and saved that $3.406 million. So if I do that, right, and considering all of the other free agents the Vikings have, I come up with these needs, right? We on the starting lineup, I think the Vikings need one running back. That's the departing Aaron Jones, or the free agent Aaron Jones, I should say. Two offensive linemen. I'm saying I want to replace Blake Brandel as a starter and kind of use Blake Brandel as a swing offensive lineman. He can play tackle. He can play guard. So I kind of like that flexibility as a backup, and he's not getting paid all that much. Brandel and obviously Ed Ingram, who I cut. Obviously Dalton Risner, who started in place of Ed Ingram, is also a free agent, right? So we need two options on the offensive line from a starting perspective, in my opinion. And then I need two starters on the interior defensive line. In my conversation with Nick last week, and I'll get into this a little bit more, but I kind of talked about when I'm saying starters on the interior defensive line, right? I mean an early down defender like Jonathan Bullard's role last year, and then somebody who can be an actual pass rusher. So this could be a Jerry Tillery role again, right? So this is a Jonathan Bullard role and the Jerry Tillery role. The Jerry Tillery / Jalen Redmond / we bring in Jihad Ward on third downs, right? That's what's kind of consumed in my two starter positions there on the interior defensive line. And then I need two starters at cornerback, right? So I'm going to count Mekhi Blackmon as someone who's at least flexible to play a number of snaps, but I still need to replace Byron Murphy and one of Shaq Griffin or Stephon Gilmore, from a starting perspective. And then two safeties as well, right? I'm having Harrison Smith retire. Cam Bynum as a free agent. I basically start two corners, right? And I start three safeties in the Vikings defense. Now they play with six defensive backs a lot as well, or they'll play with three corners and two safeties sometimes. Like it really varies, and they're kind of personnel effective. So if I'm counting Mekhi Blackmon as a rotational player, I want to count two players who I think can start pretty consistently at the safety position. And I also need a punter because Ryan Wright's a restricted free agent. From a backup perspective, I want a quarterback to back up JJ McCarthy because I've already decided I'm moving on from Sam Darnold as a starter. I need somebody to replace Cam Akers, a running back. I need two backup wide receivers because because we have Trent Sherfield and Brandon Powell, who are our fourth and fifth receivers last year, both as free agents. I need a tight end because Johnny Munt, the third tight end, is a free agent. I need a linebacker who's a backup because Kamu Grugier-Hill, probably the guy who played the third most out of all the linebackers last year as a free agent. And I need a corner, right? Because I want somebody whose depth who can compete with Mekhi Blackmon kind of for playing time, right? So the Vikings have four corners departing. Or four corners who are impending free agents. I guess I should phrase it, because they have Byron Murphy, they have Stephon Gilmore, they have Shaq Griffin, and they have Fabian Moreau, all of whom saw playing time. So I'm assuming Mekhi Blackmon slots into one of those spots. And then I need three other players still to kind of fill those roles. So those are the defined needs that I have, and I want to fill all of them through this free agency process, whether that's bringing back players or what have you. So that's going to be a lot of guys, but I'm going to go through and I have identified potential signings for all of them. So the first and most obvious things to get to are the two players who are restricted free agents for the Vikings. That's Ryan Wright and Theo Jackson. I decided to tender both of them as original round free agents. That's kind of the cheapest option. You can do original round, second round, or first round. And the cost for each increases as you get more restrictive, right? A second round tender means if other teams can negotiate with that player, but if they want to sign them, they have to trade you their second round pick to be able to do so, right? First round tender, same thing, but a first round pick. Original round means the round they were originally drafted. I believe if they are cut and go to another team, such as what Theo Jackson did, who was a sixth round pick by the Titans originally. I don't know if the sixth round actually applies to them there. It actually might, because, I can't see a reason for a player to be an original round player if they were signed by a team, signed by their the team that drafted them and never cut, right? Because they would play all 4 years. So I think the 6th round pick does apply to Theo Jackson. It might not apply if they move teams. So it still might be, no pick. And then it's just right of first refusal. And Ryan Wright's also right of first refusal. So I want to tender both of those guys. The cost is pretty high. It's $3.263 million, right? That's just something that escalates with the CBA. So that's why it's kind of not an even number. But the important thing there is it's not guaranteed. So we can cut either of them, particularly Ryan Wright. I'd love to bring somebody in, whether it's a cheap free agent or somebody in undrafted free agency after the draft to kind of compete for the starting punter position, right? But I do want to have the player who's entrenched, who hasn't had major holding issues, which is kind of an important role of the punter job, available to me, and I'm willing to swallow the $3.26 million to do it. You can almost certainly get Ryan Wright for less, right? So if I'm at the negotiating table, I would explore that as the Vikings first. But I'm kind of taking the easy way out on a lot of this negotiation stuff because there are a ton of names. I just kind of went through all the positions that I need to fill, and I don't want to get into the nitty gritty of projecting a contract for every single player. So just for the record, I'm using PFF. I think I might have already said this, but I'm using PFF as a resource for all these contracts, right? So they have their top 150 free agents listed with kind of contract projections for each of them. And if a guy's not on the contract projection, I'm usually going just a little bit, and I'll explain my methodology. I'm usually just going a little bit more expensive than what they got last year. But in Ryan Wright's case, obviously he's not somebody PFF has a contract projection for, so I just decided to tender. I'm kind of make it easy on myself. So that's those two, kind of easy. You put the tag on them, they can't do anything about it. They'll be a Viking next year, right? For both Ryan Wright and Theo Jackson. And again, another team could go out and sign them, but I don't know why they'd pay a mediocre punter more than $3.26 million, and a safety who really hasn't played all that much more than that either. Like, I think Theo Jackson has very specific and good value to the Vikings, and I'll kind of get into that later because he is one of my 2 starting safeties that I'm adding back to the roster. Like, I think I would have him start in place of Harrison Smith, or, take over Harrison Smith's role for the Vikings, but I just don't see other teams kind of deciding that he has that level of value, especially with a pretty robust safety market, to be honest with you, on the open market. So with those 2 being tendered, the next category I wanted to get to was extensions, right? And the Vikings only have, when I say extensions, the reason I separated these 2 players out is because the Vikings extended their void dates, and extending both of them decreases the Vikings cap hit for the 2025 season because it continues to push their void date out. So if you haven't guessed who they are, they're Byron Murphy and Aaron Jones, right? Byron Murphy, I think, is a no-brainer to re-sign. I think he might be the best corner on the free agency market. I mean, it's kind of a pretty close competition with him and a couple other players who I'll probably get to in a little bit, just talking about, but PFF actually has him projected to be the highest paid corner out of the entire group. So they have him at a 3-year deal with $52 million total. That's $17.33 million per year, right? $17.33 million per year. Also have $34.5 million guaranteed with an $18 million. So that's like the baseline parameters of the contract, right? With the 3 years, I put on 2 additional void years to spread out the signing bonus hit, and I'm going to make the signing bonus $18 million. So that makes our per year signing bonus cap charge $3.4 million. And then my base salaries for him were $7 million, $9.5 million, and $17.5 million. So that's like a $10 million cap hit to a $12 million cap hit, and you got to add $1.4 million to that. So it's more like a $12 million cap hit to a $14 million cap hit to a significantly larger something in the $20 million range for his final year. And then you have some dead cap left over. I believe there's like $7 million of dead cap kind of at the end of that deal. at that point. So, it's a pretty robust deal for Byron Murphy. I was suggesting a $15 million a year extension for him last year. So that's almost a natural upgrade to kind of what I was suggesting the Vikings do. I kind of wish they'd already locked him up right at that price, but I still like the deal for them. He was clearly their best corner. I think he can be a number one corner. He is not maybe, the shutdown corner that a Patrick Surtain is at this point, but the inside-outside flexibility and the system knowledge I think is really valuable from Byron Murphy. So like he can be your number one, and then you can situationally, and if you can put somebody who's near that level across from him with another couple rotational players underneath that, I think you're in a really, really good position in your cornerback room. So that's kind of why I like re-signing him. I also decided to bring back Aaron Jones. I mentioned that already. He's projected at 2 years for $14 million. That's $7 million a year. Also projected for $7 million guaranteed. So basically I gave that all to him in the first year. He got a $5 million signing bonus and a $2 million base salary. So his base salary for next year would be $7 million. It's very easily cuttable. Basically, it's a $2.5 million dead cap hit if you cut him. So that saves you, $7 million against the cap. And I did put 3 void years on the end of his contract to prorate that out. So actually, I should say it's a $4 million cap charge. In 2026, if you were to cut him with the way I structured it, it's $8 million. So you're still saving $4 million. And then you don't take the $3 million cap hit you'd have to take in 2027 when he becomes a void free agent, right? Aaron Jones, I think, is the best running back on the free agency market. And obviously he's a Viking, right? So I'd really like to retain him. Given that I think that's the case, I just really think there are very slim pickings in the RB market, and I don't want to shoehorn the Vikings into taking a running back in the first round of the NFL draft because they have so many other needs and so few picks, right? So I want to be aggressive. I want to sign him for a market deal, and I'm willing to give him 2 years, especially because only one's really actually guaranteed in this case, and then also because, I think he showed well enough that you might be able to keep him for 2 years. Like, I definitely think he's going to be a valid option and a very good running back next year, despite being over 30. So, those are kind of the 2 extensions with a little bit of a special case because of void years that are involved. It saves the Vikings a little bit of money. Both of them cost the Vikings money, but they cost less against the cap than they would because you're still prorating out the void money that you've already paid those 2 guys. So now I'm going to get into re-signings, right? And the first and the only real big so those are 2 big re-signings. The third big re-signing I had for the Vikings was Cam Bynum. So I did 3 years with 2 void years, for $42.75 million. That's $14.25 million a year with $28.25 million guaranteed. I gave him a $15 million signing bonus and then had base salaries of $7.25 million and $14.5 million, right? So once again, he's getting all of his guaranteed cash in the first 2 years. Murphy got it in the first 2 years. Aaron Jones got it in his first year, and Cam Bynum gets it in his first 2 years with a final year of $14.5 million unguaranteed. And that, if you notice, makes up the difference between 42.75 and 28.25, right? I think system continuity in the secondary is going to be something that's important for the team to have, especially with so many pieces that are potentially going out the door. That's why I like keeping Byron Murphy and Cam Bynum, right? So now 3 of your pieces were starters last year rather than just 1 out of 6 in Josh Metellus. Obviously, Mekhi Blackman, we're expecting a little bit more from, has been in the system as well. So now you're really replacing, 3 players who need to get integrated in a very unique and kind of complex coverage scheme from the Vikings. Complex may not be the right word. But they do a lot of things different than any other teams, and they ask their players to do a wide variety of roles. So trying to onboard, 6 different people in one off season, I think is a pretty precarious ask. So it would really help to have two guys who already have been in the system and know the system retained. So that's kind of why I wanted to do that. I'm also going to retain Shaq Griffin, speaking of the secondary. And he's kind of going to kind of be my Mekhi Blackman insurance. So last year, Griffin got like $4 million guaranteed on a $4.5 million deal. This year, I'm upping that a little bit to $5 million. I don't think he's going to have a robust free agent market, but I think, $5 million is a reasonable ask from him. So 1 year, $5 million, 4.5 of that is guaranteed. So if something goes catastrophically wrong, I guess the Vikings can kind of save $500,000, right? And to kind of make that work, I'm going to give him the majority of the money up front. This is what the Vikings did last year with Griffin. So, he's not worried about getting cut. And I'm going to guarantee a base salary of 1.255, and then the final $500,000 isn't guaranteed. Maybe that's in per game roster bonuses, something like that. I kind of, because I have so many contracts here, like I could get in the weeds of how per game roster bonuses or option bonuses or kind of incentives, or there's a whole variety of different things that the Vikings will apply in their real contracts. It just doesn't make for great podcasting, in my opinion, right? So the basis for Shaq Griffin is $3.245 million signing bonus. That takes your minimum salary out, which is guaranteed. That's 1.255. And then the $500,000 add in. So you have a 1.755 base salary, right? And that all adds up to $5 million. So, just kind of some weird accounting math based on the minimum salaries there to get a not even number for the signing bonus, but I just kind of wanted to work out so it all added up to a round number, which is 1 year, $5 million for Shaq Griffin. The next player I'm going to bring back is probably going to raise some eyebrows in terms of people listening to this, but I had to bring back Nick Mullins for 2 years, $5 million. And I'll kind of get into the decision to bring back Nick Mullins a little bit later in the podcast, but this means I'm not bringing back Sam Darnold or Daniel Jones. And I'll go a bit more into the weeds of how the comp picks work later, but it's because I need comp picks for both of those players, and I'm projecting like a $5 million contract or something like that for Daniel Jones. I need those two comp picks to actually make my formula work, so I get that third round comp pick for Sam Darnold, right? So this is the first kind of decision that we're seeing as kind of a negative side effect for really shooting for that third round comp pick. So I don't think Mullins would rise to the threshold of a player who, earns a compensatory pick. Like, I just don't think somebody's going to want to pay him, even $3 million. That's why I have him at 2 years, $5 million for $2.5 million a year, right? That gets him back into the quarterback room, has a solid backup for JJ McCarthy. We also have Brett Rippon in the room, so that takes care of kind of your three quarterbacks. But what it means is that you still have the flexibility to move on from him, because I only guaranteed $2.5 million, right? So I guaranteed the first year of the contract and then tacked on a second year just to have another year of team control for him. And I think he'd be amenable to that just because of the indication that he keeps getting paid in the NFL, right? I think Mullins' time is kind of run out overall. But I gave him, a fully guaranteed first year, which means I gave him a signing bonus, so he gets money up front right away of $1.245 million. And then he has a salary of $1.255 million. That's his minimum salary that he can earn this year, right? So he gets as much money as he can up front out of that guaranteed money, and then the rest is a guaranteed salary. And then the second year of the contract would just be a $2.5 million deal. You could add incentives into this or whatever for playing time, if JJ McCarthy unfortunately gets hurt again or something like that, right? Where it can escalate Nick Mullins' earning potential. But, again, that's a little bit into the weeds for what I'm trying to do here. The next player I added back was Jonathan Bullard. I kind of foreshadowed that a little bit by saying we needed 2 interior defensive linemen, including somebody who plays the Jonathan Bullard role, right? Last year, he got 1 year, $2.25 million. So I'm giving him 1 year, $2.5 million, a $250,000 raise, kind of a cost of living adjustment, right? And that's $1 million guaranteed on that deal, which comes in the form of a $1 million signing bonus and then $1.5 million in salary. So that is, just kind of he's a rotational player who's in his 30s. I don't think he's going to have a significant market outside of Minnesota, but I really like what he brings to the Vikings in terms of his early down run defense. And I think if the Vikings were to add another interior defensive lineman, they'd have to consider somebody who can be a quality early down run defender. And if they are able to add somebody who's a great early down run defender and offers significant pass rush use, that's pretty awesome. I just don't really see that in the market for the Vikings unless there's somebody in the draft, right? And I'm not too well versed with draft guys. And I wouldn't count on somebody being there who can do both of those things at a high level at 24 anyway. Like those guys are really rare in the NFL draft. So, and like somebody with that skill set, I would think should go before 24, right? Somebody who's ready to play right away, who can defend the run at a high level and also get after the passer. And then if you look at the free agency options, guys like BJ Hill or something like that, or is a name I've heard a lot, but I think he's going to end up costing significantly more than what Jonathan Bullard is, right? So I'd rather bring Bullard back at that cap hit than spend it on somebody from the outside. And then try to take a look at the Jerry Tillery, Jihad Ward role, like that combo role for who I'm going to get alongside Bullard on the interior defensive line, because I want two guys. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of how I'm structuring that, but basically it's just a slight raise for Jonathan Bullard, 1 year, $2.5 million. And then another slight raise, just return. I don't know if there's a better option, and I don't think he'll have options really outside of the Vikings, is Johnny Munt. So I'm going to give him 1 year and $2.25 million. He made $2 million last year, right? So it's just a slight raise. Again, he gets $1 million guaranteed. I think he made 750,000 or 750,000. Geez, it took me 3 takes to get that, but he made $750,000 guaranteed last year. That's why I'm giving him $1 million. Again, it's just a little bit of a bump up. It's kind of the same deal with Jonathan Bullard. Because Munt has enough accrued seasons, his base salary is 1.255. So that's an unguaranteed minimum base salary, but I'll give him $995,000 as a signing bonus. That's fully guaranteed. I guess we add 5,000 of the salary or something to get to 1 million. It's not really that big of a deal. Basically it's indicating we want him to play for the Vikings. So that's kind of Johnny Munt's deal. The next deal, I also want to bring Trent Sherfield back. So that'll be 1 year, $2 million with $1 million guaranteed again. That means it's a $775,000 signing bonus. And then I'm sorry, I had that number wrong. It's a $745,000 signing bonus with another 1.255 salary just based on his years accrued. That adds up to $2 million, $1 million guaranteed. So it'll just be, $255,000 of salary will be guaranteed. And then finally, the last re-signing I'm going to have is Kamu Grugier-Hill. That's just honestly, like Trent Sherfield is somebody who I think adds value as a bigger bodied player. He's not like a contested catch receiver, but he has the mass to be a solid blocker on rundowns. And I think this is a valuable skill set for the Vikings. I also think his special teams play, particularly as a gunner, adds value to the Vikings in a way that I want to back. Similarly, Kamu Grugier-Hill has significant special teams value. He played a rotational role, as kind of the backup as a linebacker last year. So there's almost certainly valid options on the outside for a receiver like a Trent Sherfield or a linebacker like a Kamu Grugier-Hill. I'm just kind of taking the easy route out and going with what I know. So certainly be willing to get somebody else at this price range for the Vikings if they think they've identified somebody through their pro personnel who's better. I just, am not scouting all 31 other teams to try to find the next Trent Sherfield or Kamu Grugier-Hill. So I'm just going to go with what I know, right? And for Kamu, that's one year, $1.5 million. Again, a slight upgrade from what he got last year, and only $245,000 guaranteed. And that's what his signing bonus is going to be. So he's going to get, again, a minimum base salary of $1.255 million plus $245,000 equals $1.5 million total. So that's it for the re-signings, right? So I'm bringing back Ryan Wright. I'm bringing back Theo Jackson, Byron Murphy, Aaron Jones, Cam Bynum, Shaq Griffin, Nick Mullins, Jonathan Bullard, Johnny Munt, Trent Sherfield, and Kamu Grugier-Hill. Those are the guys from the Vikings that are leaving that I'm going to bring back. I'll get into the guys who are completely gone a little bit later, but that means I still need 2 offensive linemen. I still need an interior defensive line starter. I still need a corner because I'm counting Shaq Griffin kind of as a backup, right? So I'll have Byron Murphy be my number 1 guy. I have a question mark at my number 2 spot, but then for the number 3 spot, I kind of have Mekhi Blackman and Shaq Griffin competing, right? And then I brought back both of my safeties that I want in Theo Jackson and in Theo Jackson and in Cam Bynum. So I'm feeling pretty good in that room, but honestly, I kind of want to add a little bit more competition. I also brought back Ryan Wright, right? So for my backup quarterback, I brought back Nick Mullins. I still need a depth running back. I still need, even though I brought back Trent Sherfield, I still need somebody to replace Brandon Powell, who I'm going to let walk. And yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at. So it kind of leads to 2 offensive linemen, 1 interior defensive lineman, 1 corner as the big cornerstones of what I need. And then I also need kind of a backup on the interior offensive line because I'm cutting Ed Ingram. And then I didn't mention this earlier, but I also decided I wanted to bring in some competition for Theo Jackson rather than assuming he'd be the starter. So I added another safety as well to the secondary. So with my outside signings, I'm going to start kind of with the most boring ones first, and then we'll get to the kind of exciting ones towards the end of this, just to give you guys a little bit of cliffhanger and keep you going. So the first outside signing is Olamide Zaccheaus. I view him as a flat upgrade to Brandon Powell. Powell has been very sure-handed as a punt returner, but he's been less than dynamic. He's had like the worst punt return average in the NFL for each of the past 2 years. Obviously, the Vikings aren't super interested maybe in returning every single punt, or just how they're punted to. They end up with a lot of fair catches, and Powell has been very sure-handed, so that's nice. But I just think Zaccheaus would be a bit of an upgrade. Zaccheaus also did a bunch in the Washington offense as a receiver after the catch. Now they were kind of lacking talent there this year, but I've always liked him, honestly, since he came out of Virginia as kind of a slot option. So I'm just kind of trying to replace him or put him in Brandon Powell's role 1-for-1. There was also a really, really good piece by Alec Lewis at The Athletic that had a bunch of nuggets from the combine in terms of what he was hearing from sources he has on the Vikings, maybe talk from other teams around the league while at the combine as well. And one of the things that he mentioned in there is that the Vikings were looking for outside help at punt returner, which suggests that Brandon Powell's kind of on the outs. So that's kind of why I'm looking at Zaccheaus, because of his punt return flexibility, as well as being a depth wide receiver, just like Brandon Powell was, and trying to get that replacement, right? So I'm going to give him a little bit of guaranteed money because he had some production last year. So I think there is going to be a little bit of a market for him, although he is not on PFF's free agent. So I just kind of had to wing it in terms of what he was going to get. I gave him 1 year, $3 million. So that's an upgrade on what Powell was getting. That's an upgrade on Trent Sherfield. It's not like it's an incredible contract, but it is some money for a veteran receiver who's, 28, 29, something like that. So, and he also is going to get a chunk, $1.25 million guaranteed. That's going to come in the form of a signing bonus. So he gets paid the day he signs the contract, or, soon after. I think signing bonuses technically aren't the day players sign contracts. Usually there's a date in the future that it actually gets paid out. But that's a ridiculous digression. I shouldn't have spent time on that. And then $1.75 million is his base salary. It's not guaranteed. So if it's not working out, the Vikings can move on and kind of do something else. But, I kind of like that there. And, if I don't mention it, these guys don't have void years. So the only players I put void years on so far are Byron Murphy, Aaron Jones. Can't buy them. I'm just trying to keep as much money in the cap hits for the 2025 and 2026 as I can, because there's not a lot of reason to kind of nickel and dime the cap in that way with these hits. The next player I'm going to bring in is Donta Foreman. So he was with the Browns last year, I believe, played a little bit. The reason I like him is because he's a lot bigger back, right? And is very useful in short yardage and those kind of situations. The Vikings struggled, I think, a little bit running the ball in short yardage. I would put that more on the offensive line than I would on Aaron Jones, but obviously Jones is not a power player. Foreman is somebody who's had a significant workload in the NFL before. I would hope he's able to carry that workload a little bit. He also has some pass protection chops, which I think is important in a rotational back and a second back. And I'm just really not that big of a fan of Cam Akers, to be honest. I know there are a lot of people who like Cam Akers. He's just not someone I would bring back. Like, I put Foreman on a minimum contract, and if you told me I could have Foreman on a minimum contract or Akers on a minimum contract, I would choose Foreman at this point, right? So that's like my personal take, but basically I gave Foreman no dollars guaranteed. I gave him a minimum contract, so it's 1 year for $1.255 million, right? That's the least that he can get paid. So that's kind of the idea there. I would think that the hope for the Vikings in the case where he's like the backup, or anybody of his caliber, including Cam Akers, is the backup, is that the Vikings draft a running back relatively early, maybe with their 3rd round pick, right? 97 overall. It's supposed to be a pretty deep running back class. So I would hope you can still get somebody who has a lot of viability at that point in the draft. Or if they move back from their, number 24, they get a 2nd round pick, they get an additional 3rd round pick, something like that, right? So let's say you have 34 and like somewhere in the mid 60s or something like that, in a trade back kind of scenario, then you can take a running back kind of in the early 3rd round, maybe. But that is where I would be targeting getting a running back rather than the 1st round of the draft for this class. So those are kind of my thoughts on Foreman, right? He's a placeholder for a whole bunch of veteran guys, but one of the keys with him is that I didn't want the running back position to go over $2.5 million because I didn't want to count it against my comp pick formula, right? So if I'm bringing in an outside guy, I can't pay him a lot. So that was kind of that, right? There are kind of interesting reclamation projects, whether it's a Nick Chubb or a J.K. Dobbins, who I think would maybe be paid more like the bell cow, something like that. But I just don't necessarily see the Vikings bringing them in because I think their cost is going to be more than what a comp pick would cost. So the next player I went ahead and signed is competition at safety. It's Rayshon Jenkins, who was recently released by the Seahawks. The reason that sentence is important, right, is because he was released, he doesn't count against the comp pick formula. So you can kind of pay him whatever you want. And I gave him what I thought was equivalent to the deal that the Vikings gave Shaq Griffin last year, right? It's kind of a defensive back who's had a large veteran contract, fell out of favor, bounced around to a couple teams from the Chargers to the Seahawks. Now it has been cut. I guess Griffin was technically a free agent, but has been cut. But, a prior starter who had pretty significant value and is now becoming a journeyman at this point in his career. So I want to give him a fully guaranteed deal, because I think he can add value and competition to the room in a place where I think the Vikings want to have four viable players in the safety room, because if one gets hurt, and they've had very good luck in that room over the last couple of years, you don't have anybody, right? So, and you have like, again, it's been 90+% of the snaps that safeties have played. So you're going to have a fourth player who you're comfortable playing, almost 100% of the snaps. And that's why I want to bring Jenkins in. 1 year, $4.5 million, fully guaranteed. I gave him a $2.5 million signing bonus and a $2 million salary. So that's bringing him in. I think he's maybe more of a box player than a deep player at this point, but those pickings are slim in terms of players at the safety position, or really any position, who don't count against the comp pick formula at this point. And then the final kind of just depth piece I brought in was an interior offensive lineman. I chose Nick Gates, who was, I believe, played for Washington and the Giants and was on the Eagles practice squad most recently. He's a center kind of guard. I think he primarily played center. But, the Vikings kind of had Dan Feeney on the roster as a swing interior offensive lineman last year. He didn't play a single snap because they didn't have any injuries on that, right? They benched Ingram for Risner, but Risner and Ingram combined for 100% of the right guard snaps. So, Feeney never got a chance to play. Maybe bring him back. I don't really care. I just kind of picked a name that I'd heard of and I knew had pretty decent starting experience, even if he's not all that good. I gave him a minimum deal of $1.255 million to be kind of the backup interior offensive lineman if like a Michael Juergens doesn't work out, right? Who was kind of on the practice squad all last year. So that kind of makes up the kind of low key outside signings. Now I have 4 big signings that I want to get into, and these are going to be the guys who get really excited about on the first day of free agency if the Vikings pull off these signings. The first one is going to be a guy I mentioned last week on my pod with Nick in terms of need. It's Will Fries. So I'm pretty sure it's Fries. I need to go look it up and see if he's like said it on, where they do the player intros for Sunday Night Football and that sort of thing. Because I just don't think it's pronounced the same as my last name, which is pronounced Fries, right? And as far as I know, like I'm not related to him or anything. So it kind of, so long story short, I'm going with the Fries pronunciation until I hear otherwise for him. And his contract is 4 years for $57.25 million. So that's $14.31 million a year with $30 million guaranteed. So I gave him a $15 million signing bonus, and then I gave him base salaries of 5, 10, and I split the last 2 years in half, and it came out to $13.625 million for each of those 2 years. So that 4-year contract has 1 void year on it. That spreads the $15 million signing bonus out over all 5 years. It'll mean he has a $3 million cap hit in that 5th year where he's not under contract. But, I get the $30 million in the first 3 years with only $8 million cap hit and then a $13 million cap hit in the first 2 years, right? So I'm definitely saving money compared to the guaranteed money that I'm spending and kind of pushing that money off into the future a little bit. But that obviously makes sense for a contract structure because the salary cap keeps going up and up and up. And the Vikings get a starting right guard, who I'm really a pretty big fan of, and it's not just the name. Like, and granted, I haven't watched like a ton of Will Fries, right? But I think the level of play, it seems like he was playing at for the Colts before getting injured this year, meaning, what he played at in 2023 and kind of what he had grown into from being a late round draft pick in 2021 was a really good and promising player. So I'd like to pay that and maybe hopefully get a little bit of a discount compared to the top end of the guard market with a guy who's been injured, right? So that's kind of my goal there. And I get a starting right guard out of it. Now I'm going to go to the left guard position, and I chose to sign a guy who I also talked about in my episode with Nick, Ben Bredesen from the Bucks. He played left guard for the Bucks this past year. I think he was originally with the Ravens, but Bredesen wasn't on the PFF tracker, and I kind of think that's a pretty major omission from them. And granted, they don't have him graded highly, right? So maybe it's just okay, well, he's not on our radar, but if they were to project him, he'd make more money, because I think he's going to make a pretty significant chunk of change in free agency, given that he played nearly 100% of the snaps for the Ravens last year, right? And they had a pretty good offensive line overall. They had a much improved run game. And Tristan Wirfs moved from the right side to the left side, right? So he probably has some help with Tristan Wirfs. They had drafted a really good center in Graham Barton. So, there's some factors coming into this play that probably helped Bredesen out, but he was still part of a really, really good unit, and I think that's going to get rewarded in free agency. So I use the contract that PFF has for Aaron Banks as the baseline for the Ben Bredesen contract. I also heard something today where people are saying Aaron Banks is going to get could approach $20 million a year, depending on the market for him. PFF has him at $8.5 million a year, right? So I just don't think their contract projection for Banks is very accurate, and I don't think having Bredesen off the list is very accurate, which is why I feel okay giving him 3 years, $25.5 million. Like I said, that's $8.5 million a year. I'm also using 2 void years in this, but the key is I'm only giving Bredesen $10 million guaranteed, right? I would say he's something of a 1-year wonder from the Bucks, so I only want to guarantee the first year of that deal and then kind of make it year by year. Maybe this doesn't work in terms of what we want to give somebody in free agency, but I don't really have anything to go by because he wasn't projected by PFF. So I'll do 3 years, $25.5 million, $10 million guaranteed. That is $8.5 million signing bonus, a $1.5 million base salary in year 1, fully guaranteed, then $7 million and $8.5 million. That's very cuttable the next couple years, right? So if I have the $8.5 million signing bonus, that's something like what is it? It would be, sorry, I don't know why I'm doing math. It would be $1.7 million per year. So if you cut them after the first year, $1.7 million times 4 this is wonderful podcasting, is $6.4 million. So you're still saving money. Off of that $7 million is basically net neutral in year 1. And then you save the $8.5 million or even more than that really on the rest of the deal. So you get out of there at 1 year, $10 million, and you save $15.5 million on the contract if he doesn't work out as kind of the starting left guard for you. I think it's a pretty reasonable contract, again, for somebody who isn't projected all that highly. And it seems strange to me. I haven't really seen him on any top free agents lists. So, and there are certainly insiders who are more plugged into where teams value these players than I am, but it's just a little curious based on, his level of play, and then also the unit's level of play for a really good team where he was a starter this past year. So if you want to put Aaron Banks in there, he's certainly an option for you to put in and slot right in to that contract. PFF had him at $15 million guaranteed, right? So maybe you guarantee more of the second year salary or something like that, or you can do that for Bredesen as well. But I just kind of tried to do what I could with the numbers. So the next player I signed, and this is the biggest signing of Will Fries might be the biggest signing in the free agency class, but the 2 gems of the free agency class would be Will Fries and Charvarius Ward. I think I had mentioned on the last podcast that Travarius Ward had some personal issues that he was dealing with in 2024 that I think affected his level of play, right? Because he was a really, really stellar corner up to that point, had a phenomenal 2023 when the 49ers went to the Super Bowl with him, obviously played for the Chiefs and won a Super Bowl with them before that. And I looked it up, just to make sure I had what it was right. And Ward this past year in October, very tragically had his 1-year-old daughter pass away, right? So I think that obviously for anybody would be a huge distraction if you're trying to do anything, right? So I think that really probably helped affect his level of play, and I think he is probably a lot better player than what he put out on the field last year. So I'm very willing to give him, even if he's a bit of an older player, I think he'll be 29 for this season, right? So this is going to be 29, 30, and 31 age seasons for a cornerback. I'm willing to give him 3 years, $43.5 million. That's $14.5 million per year. And in that there's $25 million guaranteed. So all that guaranteed money will get paid out in the first 2 years. I also included 2 void years on this deal. It's a $14 million signing bonus, minimum base salary. That's $1.255 million in year 1. And then to make up the rest of the $25 million, I put it at $9.745 million in year 2. The average is a little bit inflated in this deal because I put the final year at 18.5, right? That's $4 million more than the 14.5 million. Makes him a very easy cut candidate in that third year. If I were an agent, it wouldn't be a deal in terms of numbers that I love, but that's kind of what he was projected for in terms of total value, number of years, and guaranteed money. So I kind of stuck to that and raised that final number on him a little bit. Maybe you give him a way to earn guarantees on that, or have, incentives for high levels of play, and that kind of eases that out a little bit. So that's kind of the Ward deal, right? You keep a very low year 1 salary, cut over 5 years, you're really only approaching $4 million for his year 1 cap hit. And even then you're at $12 million on year 2. So both of those are below well below the threshold there. Then the final player I'm going to sign is the interior pass rusher that I kind of teased earlier. There are a number of good options for this. Javon Hargrave is going to be a free agent, and Alec Lewis's piece that I mentioned earlier tied the Vikings pretty heavily to Javon Hargrave and another player that I'm going to mention in a little bit here. But the player I went with was Levi Onwuzurike, and the reason I didn't go with Hargrave, I probably would have gone with him, was just because he wasn't part of PFS projections, so I could go with Onwuzurike's projections and just kind of use that pretty easily. He's 2 years, $16.5 million. That's $8.25 million, $8.25 million per year. Obviously a Lions interior pass rusher who had kind of a career year, has dealt with injuries throughout his career. Kind of the profile of somebody Kwesi would sign, although the career year might turn him off, right? He usually goes for guys who were injured the most recent year, but have played a ton and played pretty well. Kind of your Will Fries is kind of maybe a little bit more of his profile, but PFF has him also at $10 million guaranteed. So that's what I'm going to do on that. With that, I'm going to give an $8 million signing bonus and a $2 million base salary in year 1, right? So all the guaranteed money is in year 1, but I'm pushing a little bit of it back into the second year, and a $6.5 million base salary in year 2. I'm also voiding this deal, right? So I have void years as a $4 million cap hit in year 1, an $8.5 million cap hit in year 2, and then the $6 million have to get paid in 2027 in year 3 of the deal. So that was kind of my work through of free agency, right? So I'm retaining Ryan Wright, retaining Theo Jackson, Byron Murphy, Aaron Jones, Cam Bynum, Shaq Griffin, Nick Mullins, Jonathan Bullard, Johnny Munt, Trent Sherfield, Kamu Grugier-Hill, and then I'm adding Olamide Zacchaeus, Donta Foreman, Rayshawn Jenkins, Nick Gates, Will Fries, Ben Bredesen, Travarius Ward, Levi Onwuzurike. that gives me a ton of flexibility going into the draft because I've filled needs for starters at every single position. I can draft an interior defensive lineman. I can draft an interior offensive lineman. I can draft a running back in the first round if I want. I can draft another corner. Basically all of those positions become open to me if I make all of these signings. Now I'm spending a lot of money. If you go through and look at the results, I ended up with $4.85 million in cap in 2025. I ended up with $700,000 in cap in 2026. If you roll over the money, that's $5.5 million. Now, I will say I'm doing a good job of approximating what the Vikings will actually have to spend against the cap, right? This is basically accounting for all 53 players on the Vikings roster and the practice squad players throughout the season. There are always going to be some additional expenditures. Teams like to have about $10 million in wiggle room for the cap heading into the season, but practice squad players are almost inclusive of that $10 million, right? So, you save, it's probably about $5 or $6 million once you take out the practice squad players from that. So I have, roughly that to work with. And it's also noteworthy that I'm not restructuring any contracts, right? Justin Jefferson has his option bonus that'll get prorated out, and I'm going to talk about this a bit later. There are some big contracts that the Vikings have with big base salaries that could easily be converted into a signing bonus, pushed out into the salary cap in future years. And the same is obviously true of 2026, right? Where I have technically $700,000, to work with, although really technically it's $5.5 million, right? Because of the rollover. And then if I look into the 2027 cap, I'm not overly burdening that with high cap hits. This would give me $35 million in 2027, but that $35 million is like, I have to add like 40 something players because of how few guys the Vikings have under contract that year, right? So if I were to look at this from the base cap perspective, right? When you go to the over the cap page for the Minnesota Vikings and it lists all the players on the Vikings contract and it says cap space in the top with the big number, what you would actually see, I did the math on this, is $8.9 million for 2025, $33.4 million for 2026. And if you add the rollover, it's $42.3 million and $77.8 million for 2027, right? So if I told you the Vikings had, and this is what anybody else who's doing contracts would tell you, I'm just kind of being very meticulous about how I do it. If I told you, okay, I still have $9 million in cap space for this year, I still have $33 million next year, and I still have 77 or almost $78 million in 2027, I think you're very, very happy with that cap situation. So I think you're probably spending more than you need to, right? I kind of doubled up on safety a little bit. Maybe you really like Mekhi Blackman and you think that I don't need to bring Shaq Griffin back, right? That frees up $10 million off the bat. Maybe you don't want to sign two guards, so you only sign Will Fries or you only sign Ben Bredesen, and you can free up a significant amount of money that way. The other scenario that I wanted to take a look at is the Vikings signing Milton Williams. I think signing Milton Williams is difficult it's basically impossible for the purposes of this exercise because he's somebody who I would expect to play 70+% of the snaps if the Vikings signed him, and his contract projection is $21 million, right? So if you go back to the start, that would be a third round comp pick, which would cancel out the Sam Darnold contract. Now, the Vikings did cancel out, I would argue, accidentally, a third round comp pick last year because they canceled out the comp pick they should have gotten for Danielle Hunter. That was a little bit of a convoluted situation. So if you remember last year when the Vikings signed Shaq Griffin, there was kind of an outroar among Vikings fans who were very conscious about the cap that they had cost themselves that third round comp pick, right? Because you go on the over the cap page, it has all the free agents that cancel out, all of a sudden Shaq Griffin is canceling out Danielle Hunter, and the Vikings don't get a third-round comp pick because they signed him pretty late in the process, right? But before the compensatory window had closed. And one of the things that came out after that, Nick Corte is the guy at Over the Cap who does this, and he does a phenomenal job kind of cataloging and tracking everything, right? And at the time, what he said was that Grenard would need to play about 70% of the snaps for the Vikings, and his projections had Grenard at 35% because that was the average of snaps Grenard had played over the course of his career. So Grenard would have had to play 70% of the snaps to count as a third-round comp pick for the Vikings. Well, Grenard did play 70% of the snaps. He played 80% of the snaps, right? He also got Pro Bowl honors, which gives you a bonus as well. So, he really shot up there in terms of the comp formula and in terms of getting extra points compared to what Corte's projections were. The thing is, when Corte said that, and when the Vikings signed Shaq Griffin, what they didn't realize is that the way that teams understood and Corte understood the NFL Management Council handled certain contracts, and I'm going to get into a little bit of an explainer here, was not how they were handling them. So the NFL Management Council decided that if you restructured a contract to add void years, instead of basically just keeping the AAV of the contract the same, what they would do is they'd take the total salary and divide it by the number of years remaining on the deal, like the total cap hits for the future years, and divide it by the number of true years remaining on the deal. So in the article, because this happened to the 49ers and the Bills, were expecting third-round comp picks last year and didn't get them. And they kind of asked the NFL for clarity, being like, hey, we were expecting this. This is what our math says. What was the difference here? The NFL apparently had a contract like Eric Armstead's, who was was a San Francisco 49er, was on a 5-year deal that averaged like $17 million or something like that. And they prorated the third to last year of his deal over the course of the final couple years and added void years onto that. What the NFL did is it took a $28 million cap hit in 1 year and a $17 million cap hit plus, another $11 million in the void years, added those two together to get $56 million, divided it by the final 2 years of the deal, which makes no sense, right? Because it wasn't an extension. It wasn't a change to the overall value. It wasn't a change to the amount of money Eric Armstead was getting paid. It was just a change to when it counted against the cap, and made his average annual value $28 million, despite him never getting paid $28 million in a single year of the deal. And none of that made sense, but it's what they decided to do. So Corte changed his formula to account for that. And because he did that, Jonathan Grenard is still a 4th-round pick, despite hitting the threshold, right? So the Vikings are losing out on a comp pick for Danielle Hunter because when they did their cap math, the environment that they thought they were operating in, which was the environment that the other NFL teams also thought they were operating in, right? So you could argue it's a mistake by the Vikings for not understanding what the NFL Council is or not hedging enough. But other NFL teams also made this mistake because of a really ridiculous, honestly, decision by the NFL Management Council for how they counted that money. And it's costing the Vikings a 3rd-round pick right now, right? Because I doubt they signed Shaq Griffin at the time that they did. And in fact, Ben Gessling reported at the time that the Vikings thought that Grenard was canceling out Danielle Hunter when they signed Shaq Griffin. So they figured they only had Kirk Cousins' 3rd-round pick anyway, and they were kind of sacrificing like a 6th-round pick. Kind of doesn't matter, right, when they signed Shaq Griffin. So I wanted to get through that explainer because it's pretty convoluted, but it matters for kind of how we're looking at comp picks, and it also matters to understand that the Vikings did not actively choose to throw away a 3rd-round comp pick, and I think they would very much value getting that 3rd-round comp pick for Sam Darnold. So I think it throws into question what they'd be willing to pay Milton Williams on the open market. And The last time I had an episode with Nick, we mentioned Levi and Onwuzurike. I'm recording this whole Wednesday night. He signed a 4-year, $80 million extension at the beginning of the day. So really, Milton Williams is the only player available on the defensive tackle market who's going to garner, a really high price tag, which is almost certainly going to drive his price up compared to maybe what it would have been if both he and Onwuzurike were on the open market. So PFF has Williams projected at 3 years, $63 million. That's $21 million guaranteed, right? And I wanted to see what I could do if I wanted to fit Milton Williams under the cap. So I chose to, in this case, I would not be signing Levi Onwuzurike and be signing Milton Williams instead, right? A significant upgrade. So again, 3 years, $63 million. And I'm actually going to put 3 void years on this contract because I'm going to use another trick that I want to talk about to kind of extend this, right? So he has $40 million guaranteed. I give him a $25 million signing bonus that separates it out to $5 million a year. And then I want to give him minimum base salaries in both 2025 and 2026. The reason is I'm running up against my cap in both years, basically. So I want to spread that money out as far as possible. However, Milton Williams definitely wanted to get paid, and I want to pay players their guaranteed money in the first 2 years of the deal, especially with this only being a 3-year deal. So to get to $40 million over the first 2 years, I'm going to take the difference, which is $12.165 million, right? So my 2 minimum salaries. And then I add that in and I make that an option bonus. What an option bonus is it's a delayed signing bonus. So the Vikings use this with Justin Jefferson. The Eagles use this with like every single one of their contracts. Jalen Hurts has it in like every single year of his contract. That's why if you go over the cap, his base salary is the minimum every single year. But essentially, it gets paid at a certain date in the next season. It's guaranteed. So unlike a roster bonus, which is basically, it gets paid out if a player is on the team at a certain date, the option bonus, basically it has to be paid by September 1st, and it's written different in the language of kind of every contract, but it has to be paid by September 1st, but they can choose to exercise it anytime between March and September. That's kind of like the quote unquote option part of it is when they pay the money. And it just prorates money to the contract in future years rather than a signing bonus, which prorates the money immediately as soon as the deal is signed, right? You could also do a roster bonus restructure, but because the Vikings have used option bonuses now for their 2 biggest contracts in Christian Darrisaw and Justin Jefferson, I would expect that they would use it here for Milton Williams as well. This minimizes Williams's cap hits over the first 2 years, right? It's like $6 million in year 1, and then it's something like $8 million in year 2 of a $63 million deal, right? So that's $16 million in the first 2 years. It balloons his 3rd year cap hit to something like $30 million, but and then you have $17 million kind of in dead money when he's done, right? So it's a big contract, a lot of money. It's something you can push out. Again, I have 3 years, right? Because money in signing bonuses and option bonuses prorates to a maximum of 5 years. So, when he signs the deal, you have 3 contract years and 2 void years. It gets divided over into 5, right? So the $25 million becomes $5 million in each of those 5 years. Then in the 2nd year of the option bonus, you need the 3rd void year because you have 2 contract years remaining and now 3 void years that you can divide the $12 million over. So in this case, where I signed Milton Williams, I moved the money around a little bit, in the salaries to make this work, but he has $2.1 million in 2025, $55,000 in cap space in 2026. That would be $2.245 million with rollover, and then $4.75 million in cap space in 2027. Right. So those are my harshest cap numbers. Right. You can technically count that as something like, something like $30 million in 2026 and something like $40 million in 2027 if you want, but it kind of nukes your cap compared to what you do by signing a lower priced free agent at that defensive tackle spot, right? You kind of have to really work for it to get under the cap in those situations. Now you can prorate out the other players on the Vikings, right? There's a lot of contracts that I'm going to talk about in a little bit here that can get, have salary conversions to signing bonus. So you can just push that cap money down the road. I think that's generally a fine practice. I think you don't want to over leverage yourself too far, or then you end up like the Browns. But I don't think the Vikings are in a situation where they're over leveraged doing that. So they have a little bit of flexibility, especially as long as they want to start a rookie quarterback or a quarterback on a rookie contract in JJ McCarthy to be able to do that. So to summarize for the Vikings, right, I kind of talked about everybody I was adding. We'll go in the world where I don't add Milton Williams and I add Levi Onwuzurike instead. But of the players that walked in free agency, I have Sam Darnold, Cam Robinson, Daniel Jones, Pat Jones, Stephon Gilmore, and Dalton Risner garnering comp picks, right? So all those guys need to sign during the compensatory window, and they all need to sign for more than like $2.5 million for them to count as comp picks, right? Sam Darnold obviously is going to be the big money guy. I wouldn't be shocked if he's like the first player we hear about on Monday agreeing to a contract, right? Cam Robinson, I think, is pretty heavily projected to get a starting offensive tackle contract, which would certainly put him over that. Daniel Jones, I think, kind of gets reclamation project money, which is like $5 million to $10 million. So that gets him a comp pick. By the way, Daniel Jones, and Pat Jones are not included in the PFF projections, right? So I'm just kind of using my common sense when I'm projecting them. I expect Pat Jones, as I talked about with Nick, to kind of get a DJ Wanham level contract where it's like $5 or $6 million for kind of a rotational guy over a couple of years, kind of a little bit of prove it, but like, hey, we really like what we've seen. And you had the 8 sacks last year. So we're prioritizing that as an edge rusher. Stephon Gilmore, I think, honestly, is pretty questionable of whether or not he'd garner the Vikings a comp pick, not because of his compensation when he eventually signs, but of when he's going to sign, right? And I think Dalton Risner has the same question. Neither of those guys signed in the compensatory window last year. Both signed with the Vikings well after the compensatory window happened. But because I have a number of compensatory free agents I'm signing. So just to go back, the comp free agents I'd signed are Olamide Zaccheaus, Will Fries, Ben Bredesen, Charvarius Ward, and then Levi Onwuzurike. Right, so that's 7 guys. So I have 6 guys leaving in Darnold, Robinson, Daniel Jones, and Pat Jones, Stephon Gilmore, and Dalton Risner. The 5 low ones cancel out with 5 guys I'm signing, and Darnold gets you the 3rd round comp pick. So to fill all of the Vikings' needs, right? And, you could say, oh, well, what if they get comp picks for Byron Murphy, Aaron Jones, and Cam Bynum? Well, now the Vikings need to sign players to replace those guys, right? So maybe you can add another comp pick if you let Cam Bynum walk and then treat Rayshon Jenkins as a starter, something like that. And I'm going to get into some guys who are non-compensatory pick options in a little bit too. But there's really not a lot out there on the market for guys who don't count for compensatory picks at this point. So you need to wait on some of the more the mid-level free agents, the guys you might want to spend like $3 to $5 million on to really ensure that you keep that Sam Darnold comp pick, right? And other teams are playing that game too, so you can't be confident all of your guys are going to start. So you really kind of need to see how it plays out. Other free agents I have leaving are Jerry Tillery, Brandon Powell, Dan Feeney, David Questenberry, Jihad Ward, Foster Moreau, and Cam Akers. I kind of talked about all of those guys, but it leaves me with the 53-man roster, and I'm going to try to go through this relatively quickly. I know maybe reading a 53-man roster isn't the most exciting podcast content, but quarterbacks: JJ McCarthy, Nick Mullins, Brett Rippon. Running backs, Aaron Jones, Donta Foreman, Ty Chandler. CJ Ham is my fullback. My wide receivers are Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, Jalen Nailor, Trent Sherfield, Olamide Zaccheaus as my starters. My tight ends are chalk from last year, TJ Hawkinson, Josh Oliver, Johnny Munt. My starting offensive line from left to right would be Christian Darrisaw, Ben Bredesen, Garrett Bradbury, Will Fries, Brian O'Neill. And then my backups, Blake Brandel would absorb like a swing tackle role. Walter Rouse is also in the mix as swing tackle. Nick Gates is the interior offensive lineman. Also, Michael Juergens is in that mix, right? So that's all guys who are rostered. My interior defensive line would be Harrison Phillips, Levi Onwuzurike, Jonathan Bullard, and then Jalen Redmond, Levi Drake Rodriguez, Take Taimani. So you got really good depth there, I think, but 6 total there, and then 5 edge rushers in Jonathan Grenard, Andrew Van Ginkel, Dallas Turner, and then I'm keeping Bo Richter and Gabriel Murphy. Linebacker, you have Blake Cashman, Ivan Pace, Kamu Grugier-Hill, Brian Asamoah. And then corner, you would have Byron Murphy, Travarius Ward, Mekhi Blackman, Shaq Griffin, Dwight McGlothern, and Najee Thompson, who's kind of a special teamer more than a corner. And then at safety, you have Cam Bynum, Josh Metellus, Theo Jackson, Jay Ward, Rayshawn Jenkins. Special teams, Will Reichard, Ryan Wright, Andrew DePaula. Right, so I think I filled all of my open holes at starters with quality players. I do think there are still some concerns on this roster, right? It's not perfect by any means. But, you know, I would say my weak points are quarterback depth, right, where I only have Mullins and Rippon. Running back depth, where I have Foreman and Chandler. Wide receiver 3, if you don't like Jalen Nailor, I think he's probably fine as wide receiver 3. But you could maybe argue, you know, Nailor, Sherfield, and Zaccheaus certainly isn't like the best 3 through 5 in the NFL wide receiver, right? So you could argue you want that there. Maybe some people might want to replace Garrett Bradbury. I don't in this case. I think adding good guard play around him will help him significantly as a player. Like I think it helped Drew Dahlman or somebody who you might want to target in free agency. Edge depth to me is kind of questionable. Obviously, you're expecting a leap from Dallas Turner, but now we have Bo Richter and Gabriel Murphy as kind of the depth players rather than Pat Jones and Jihad Ward. So, you know, it's certainly a step down there. Linebacker depth, like, I don't know if you're comfortable with Kamu Grugier-Hill. You're certainly not comfortable with Brian Asamoah if one of those guys gets hurt. And then cornerback 3, I don't know if I have a true starter between Mekhi Blackman and Shaq Griffin, right? So those are kind of my weak points there. So some other considerations, right? You could look to cut people. Here's the list of players that would save more than $2 million if you cut them outright, right? Pre-June 1st. I don't see a lot of value, to be honest, in post-June 1st cuts. It's just delays the cap hit by another year. So unless you're really cap strapped, like the Saints end up every single year, you know, that's when a post-June 1st cut might help. But for the Vikings' current cap situation, I see like literally no value in doing it. But so you know, pre-June 1st cuts that would save the Vikings money. Brian O'Neill, Andrew Van Ginkel, Harrison Phillips, none of those make any sense. Like the team absolutely will not do that. Josh Oliver could make some sense, but now I need to bring in a blocking tight end, right? He would save about $5 million. Josh Metellus, absolutely not. Garrett Bradbury, again, you know, some people may like that, but if you cut Garrett Bradbury, you have to replace him with a starting center. They've spent a lot more money than the $3 million that you save by cutting him. Blake Brandel only saves a couple $1 million, and Ham saves less than $3 million as well. So, you know, CJ Ham. So I really don't see any major cuts out of those players. I cut the only guy who I think really provides you significant cap savings. Maybe you could argue Josh Oliver, who saves you like almost $6 million. I think if you cut him, would be kind of on the chopping block, but those are really the only 2 guys I see being valid cut options. You know, on the flip side of that, I think there are some extension candidates Here, Brian O'Neill to me would be an extension candidate, right? He's got 2 years left on his deal. It would expire in 2020 after 2026. So, and I think he signed a 5-year extension. Maybe it was a 4-year extension. So you might want to get ahead of that. But he's somebody who's entering his 30s. So it's a question of whether the team would want to commit to that. Andrew Van Ginkel, obviously played phenomenally last year, signed only a 2-year deal. If you extend him, you can still minimize that year 1 cap hit if you want to do that. Josh Oliver, just like he's a cut candidate, you can lower the cap hit with an extension, and I think he might have earned it as kind of a quality blocking tight end. Josh Metellus, to me, is massively underpaid and would be a major extension candidate. You don't save as much money, but I believe he has something like $5 to $6 million in compensation this year between his salary, and he has like a $2.6 million bonus that he's getting. I don't know if that was from incentives or what it is, but it just kind of shows up as an other bonus on over the cap. And then Blake Cashman is another player I think I would consider, although he has 2 years left on his deal. He's just, has enough base salary with like $6 million that it might be worth it. And he's an absolutely phenomenal player. Like with that, restructures, I've talked about a lot of these guys already. Brian O'Neill has a $17 million base salary. Jonathan Grenard's at $18 million. TJ Hawkinson's at 11. Andrew Van Ginkel's at 11. Josh Oliver's at 8. Harrison Phillips is at 7. Cashman's at 5. And Bradbury's at 5. All of those are valid options if you want to add void years to the back of the deal, open up some cap space, particularly O'Neill and Grenard, right? If you do it for one of those guys, you're opening up like $15, $16 million in cap space this year. So you definitely get some value out of that. And then finally, I just wanted to run through some guys who won't count for compensatory picks because they were either contracts that were quote unquote voided out early, not under the normal course of voiding contracts, or they're players who were cut by their respective teams. At quarterback, there is nobody. Jameis Winston was on a void contract, but it was a 1-year deal that was always planned to void. It was just the Cleveland Browns are like maxed out on their credit cards in terms of cap space. So that's how they did it. Technically, Ian Book was listed by over the cap. Ian Book is an unacceptable quarterback option, right? He was a practice squad player. So at the running back position, it's all old guys, right? It's Jamal Williams, Raheem Mostert, Nyheim Hines. Nobody really all that appealing to me. Particularly if you wanted them to be like a starter or something. Maybe it's like a depth option, but still not somebody I'm looking to invest significant money in. At wide receiver, there are 3 big names that have been cut, or it's announced that they will be cut in Devontae Adams, Tyler Lockett, Christian Kirk. There's really nobody else on that market who's available that doesn't cost a comp pick. So again, unless you're going with a really, really cheap option, they're going to cost you a comp pick like I had for Olamide Zaccheaus, right? Just $3 million would still cost you. At tight end, the only player is Durham Smythe, who I think is a blocking tight end. I don't really know too much about him, but he was from the Dolphins. At offensive line, I mentioned Nick Gates, and I signed Nick Gates, but George Fant and Chukwuma Okorafor are really the only 2 other players who are non-compensatory free agents because both of those guys were cut as well. They're both in their 30s. Neither is very good. And they're both tackles, right? Importantly, which the Vikings don't really have as much of a need at. But if you wanted to bring in a swing tackle, which is something I didn't do because I'm planning to have Blake Brandel kind of operate in that role, they are options there. So let's say you don't sign Ben Bredeson, right? You keep Blake Brandel there. You ease up your comp pick situation quite a bit if you sign one of those 2 guys as opposed to somebody for $4 or $5 million who might actually cost you a comp pick. At interior defensive line, there's not a lot of guys I love either. There's DeMarcus Walker, there's Draymond Jones, who might be kind of interesting, honestly. Sheldon Rankins, I don't think is all that great. Roy Robertson Harris destroyed the Vikings like years ago as a backup interior defensive lineman for the Bears, but I just, don't know if it's there. The most interesting one, and again, somebody who Alec Lewis tied to the Vikings in his piece, is Javon Hargrave, right? So like, if you don't want to go Levi Onwuzurike, if you want to, not have him count against your compensatory formula, you can go with Javon Hargrave and be competitive for that and use your money you have without potentially costing yourself a comp pick. So I think that's really interesting. Hargrave, it looks like I don't really know the full details of this, but the 49ers signed him to a 4-year deal. And then after year one, we're like, all right, we want out of this deal, so we're going to modify it so you void after this year. And he spent most of this past year injured, so it's very much a question mark, and he's on the wrong side of 30, right? So it's not maybe the most appealing option in the world, but as a reclamation project, which Kwesi has a history of, as somebody who's been a phenomenal interior pass rusher in the past, I'm kind of interested in exploring it. I just don't love any of the interior defensive line options other than Milton Williams. And I'm not even as in love with Milton Williams as I think many people are. So it's kind of hard for me. And I think Hargrave is a valid option there. Even if I think the Vikings definitely could use an upgrade. I shouldn't say desperately, but could use a solid upgrade very effectively at that position. At edge rusher, we'd only be looking really for a depth guy, and I think Sam Hubbard is the player I would identify who has maybe a little bit more stoutness and run defense to his game. Otherwise, it's Preston Smith, who's completely washed at this point to me, and Khalil Mack, who I'm not sure if he counts as a compensatory free agent. His contract just moved around a couple times because of the Bears, and then he got traded to the Chargers. And it might have added a year onto it in there somewhere. So I don't really know how he works and whether or not he'd count as a compensatory free agent, to be honest with you. But his contract is voided. So again, I'm not 100% sure, but I wanted to throw him out there. I obviously don't think he's somebody the Vikings would pursue. At linebacker, Sione Takitaki is the only one who's kind of cut player. At corner, there's a number of guys. So Kendall Fuller, Dane Jackson, and James Bradbury are the ones who pop up on Over the Cap. If you sort by SFAs, which is their street free agents or players who were cut. But Darius Slay is also slated to be released by the Eagles, so he would be an interesting veteran option instead of, say, like a Shaq Griffin, right, to get into your rotational, or a Stephon Gilmore replacement for this year. So that's certainly an option in terms of Darius Slay. Kendall Fuller is a player who I've liked throughout his career, but I just don't know how much he has in the tank. James Bradbury, I have absolutely zero interest in. Dane Jackson, I think he was a Bill for a long time. Not really. Don't really know too much. Not all that interested. And then at safety, there's literally two players, Rayshawn Jenkins, who I signed in this exercise, and Demetrius Flanagan Fowles. So that's kind of your run through, right, of players who will not hurt the Vikings against the compensatory formula if they sign them. Obviously, any players who are available for trade, like say a Jonathan Allen, or any players who are cut between now and the start of free agency or at the beginning of free agency, also will count or will apply there. But I just gave you as full of a list as I had from what Over the Cap's information is, right? I'm not tracking like what players other teams are saying they're going to cut. So yeah, that was a lot of stuff, but hopefully, you enjoyed this episode. I tried to go as detailed as possible, as always, and give you as much insight as I can to, let's say the Vikings going all in, with the exception of deciding they want to keep that third round pick, right? And, maintain all in's not the right word. They're not doing what the Browns have been doing or what the Eagles have been doing in this exercise, but they are spending a ton of money and, leveraging their really good current and future cap flexibility to try to build a quality starting roster and competitive roster. Like, I think, if the Vikings lose guys like Cam Robinson, Gilmore, Risner, Pat Jones, Tillery, Powell, Jihad Ward. Those are guys basically who are playing Cam Akers, Sam Darnold, but are able to keep guys like Byron Murphy, Aaron Jones, Theo Jackson, Cam Bynum, Shaq Griffin, and then add guys like Will Fries, Ben Bredesen, Charvarius Ward, Levi Onwuzurike, Olamide Zacchaeus, Rayshawn Jenkins. They're going to be a better roster than what they had this time last year, and that's before even having a first-round pick in the draft, right? So you improve on a team that went 14-3. You hope that the quarterback in JJ McCarthy can give you the level of play that Sam Darnold gave you, maybe hopefully improve on that level of play, or even if he's not giving you that level of play in his first year, show enough promise that this is a team that maybe can go all in that second and third year of JJ McCarthy as a starter while you're still reaping the benefits of his rookie deal. So hopefully you guys enjoyed. That's all I have. I'm honestly shocked my voice hasn't given out after talking for an hour and a half straight, but we made it through. So you can find me, Matt Fries, at Fries Football on BlueSky. You can find my co-host Nick Olson at Nick Olson NFL on Twitter. We're at Kindred Skulls on Twitter and BlueSky. I don't really do much with that account besides tweet out the links to the shows, but certainly remember to follow us so you see when those go out. We're also available on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, and on YouTube at Kindred Skulls. And with that, Skull Vikings.